my vision of like what I wanted to do and what impact I wanted to have, I was very focused on what that actual role, what that impact would be.
If you're the kind of person who throughout their working life has always tended to take more responsibility, tended to want to be part of, the strategic vision setting, who has tended to take on a more communicative leadership role, there's a trajectory there.
One of the things that I've noticed about having a female co-CEO is that, in many points in my career, I was the only woman in the room. And at least now there are at least two. And that does change the dynamics. It gives me somebody to demonstrate that, the decision making and dialogue concept that we do.
Audrey Tsang and Carrie are the co-CEOs of Clue in Berlin. Now, Clue is the #1 doctor-recommended tracking app for periods and cycles. And the company is basically on a mission to empower people to make better choices for themselves and their bodies that are in tune with their biology. Now, last year, their original founder, Audrey Tsang, decided to step away from the day-to-day running of the business. So it presented an opportunity to design their leadership in a new way. And they wanted to do it in a way that reflects the values of the company, but also their user base, the people that log onto their app every single day. So they decided to opt for the co-CEO partnership. Now, this is something that quite a lot of companies use, but it's still very, very much in the minority. So I wanted to get them both on to really discuss the pros and cons of this setup and how it's worked for them personally and professionally, and how it has impacted the business on a day-to-day basis. Now, these two, the way they approach their answers, it's very, very clear that they're intelligent and very thoughtful people, and you can see why their partnership has worked so well. But as with anything, there's always room for improvement, and I really wanted to dig into these aspects in this episode. I really, really enjoyed speaking to these two very switched on and intelligent people, and I hope you enjoy listening to it just as much. So, without further ado, I'm Alex Bloisey, and this is the Building Our World podcast. This is a first for the show, 2 guests on at the same time, so I'll try and navigate things as best as I can. Feel free to jump in or chime in, whoever feels like they're best at answering. But I wanted to start off because last year there was a leadership change at Clue, and they went for the new style co-CEO model. Now, obviously, a break from tradition with the sort of singular CEO. So why did Clue go for this new avenue in their leadership?
Carrie, do you want to start or shall I?
Why don't you start? And I feel like a good run up to this is actually for each of us to introduce where we're coming from. And that kind of, I think, exposes the rationale for this model for Clue.
Yep.
All right, well, then I'll kick that off. So hello, I'm Audrey. I'm obviously one of the 2 co-CEOs at Clue. And as you mentioned, this is a relatively new setup for Clue. It's actually been about a year. Although, a little bit of background on myself and a spoiler on Carrie, neither of us were new to Clue. So before this, I was the chief product officer for about 2.5 years. And Carrie was the general counsel, but we'll come back to that when I pass it back to Carrie. And so just a little bit of my background and how I ended up at Clue, how I ended up as their CPO, and then how I ended up as their co-CEO. My background is in consumer tech products. I'm originally from San Francisco. Spent really my whole life there until I got a call from Audrey Tsang about a role at Clue to go and lead their product team. And, at first I was honestly like, I've never even been to Berlin. Why would I move there? Don't know much about it. But I was really curious to connect to Ida and have a great conversation with her. And we did have a great conversation about female health, about the need there. And, what I was looking for, and this was almost 4 years ago now, what I was looking for at that time in my life was really something where I could take my background in consumer products and apply that to something impactful like health, and specifically female health. And some of the things that I'm particularly curious about are the application of technology in a human, in an empathetic way, to solving problems that we face on a daily basis. Things like health and wellness, mental and emotional health and wellness, physical health and wellness. And the great thing about technology, which is not the solution in and of itself, the great thing about it is that it's widely accessible. It's also pervasive. We have it. We have our phones in our pockets every day as we go about our lives, and that allows opportunities for greater personalization. Um, Anything along the lines of preventative health, or just empowerment, and the ability to help people advocate for their health in their healthcare systems. So Ida and I had a long conversation about this, and eventually she was like, "Why don't you just come visit Berlin for a weekend? Check it out." And I did, and ultimately I just really fell in love with the team, and not just the team and what Clue was doing, but how they were going about it. And came to be their chief product officer for about 2.5 years. And at this point, before getting into the transition to co-CEO,
Mm.
I might pass over to Carrie um,
Mm.
to tell her Clue initial story.
Clue journey. We all have a clue journey. This is one of the great things about the companies. Everyone has a really, I think, personal journey and route to being here. So I have a very different background to Audrey, which is why it's so interesting to be co-CEOs with her. I'm a regulatory lawyer by background, so I spent a good decade in kind of big international corporate law, doing heavily regulated products, including medtech. And for me, I joined in 2019 to be the general counsel at Clue. And really, what precipitated that conversation for me was probably just one of those life moments. I'd had my first daughter in the UK and my second daughter in Berlin. And I was like, why was that experience so different? That's weird. Like, how different can healthcare be
Yeah.
in sort of similarly developed economies that really aren't very far away from each other? And I think that was the point for me where I started digging in a little bit into why is the reproductive healthcare experience in general so bad? Like, I pay a lot of taxes, This was not an unforeseeable event in my life. Like, why don't I have better information? Why aren't my choices clearer? Why can no one tell me whether there's actually any evidence for a certain thing that I'm being advised to do or not to do? And so I also kind of just had some really surreptitious conversations and ended up in a long chat with Ida, and um, really felt immediately when I went to the Clue office, like, wow, this would be a place where lots of like-minded people would be, very diverse people, all kinds of walks of life, all kinds of countries and backgrounds and expertise, but really just such a vibrant place to work. And so I joined, and I was, as a lawyer, what intrigued me was two things. One, Clue's approach to data privacy, which has always been extremely user first. And of course, that's what you want, right? If you're joining somewhere as a lawyer, you don't want to be going against the grain of the organization. You want to be going with the grain. And it was very clear to me from that initial conversation that user trust is key and really part of the strategy and the value proposition at Clue, not something that you sort of paper over. And then the other piece was we were just beginning to go on this massive journey of transition from being a consumer tech startup to a consumer tech startup that is also a medical device company. And that's what happens when you put a regulated medical device feature on the market as we have with Clue Birth Control, which is a feature of the Clue app that got FDA clearance last year, and we've been slowly rolling out for several months now. Very exciting. It really is a huge cultural and organizational change that you go through to support a product like that and to be regulated. And so that, again, is sort of something I spearheaded on the regulatory market entry side, and that's what set us up as a pair to be the right co-CEOs for the next phase of the journey.
Mm, fascinating. So, um, when you came to this like juncture, I mean, was it kind of an organic thing in terms of that you two would come together to form this kind of new chapter for the company? Because I'm obviously no expert in co-CEO and leadership dynamics of a company, and we're going to get into the pros and cons. But in terms of a partnership, like you have to get it right. Otherwise, it could surely be an absolute disaster for the company, just in terms of personality clashes, egos, or whatever. So, when it comes to like the nuts and bolts of it, how did you two emerge as obviously candidates to take it on? But you're almost interviewing for the role, but also interviewing as a pair as well, if you know what I mean. You have to be the right people, but you have to be the right pair at the same time. Don't know if Audrey, if you wanted to take on that.
Yeah, I think that well, first of all, it really helped that both of us had been working together for almost 2 years when the idea of taking this on and sharing this role as a co-CEOship, when that came about. And so you're absolutely right. I think for this to be successful, it does really come down to that relationship. And we had an existing relationship. So we didn't go into this not
Mm,
knowing what it would be like um, to debate something, to disagree, to agree, to support, to give feedback to each other. We knew what I think a lot of the components of building a relationship. Uh, we knew how that felt and how that would work. So one piece, and I think this is a learning, is to really choose your co-CEO. If that's a model that you're considering, choose that person carefully. Look for all of the pros, and be aware of some of the cons, with that being a part, like what that relationship actually might
mm,
play out to be like. And look for all of the pros, as in like diversity of perspective, diversity of experiences, and the richness that comes along with that. But making sure that you can productively have conversations from those two diverse places.
And I want to say there are not many people in the world that I'd want to co-CEO with. In fact, I can't think of anyone else right now that I would want to do that with, because it is such a special relationship, right? You are kind of work wives in some very significant ways. And funnily enough, our executive coach, spent quite a lot of time looking into couple therapy approaches before working with us, because that's the kind of relationship it is. And I think really the key to this being a productive and fun working relationship is having, as Audrey mentioned, a big diversity of perspective and experience. So you're not just two of the same person that's going to just be
mm,
in an echo chamber together, um, while having enough, I'm just going to say, temperamental compatibility to actually like hanging out a lot.
yeah.
Because if you didn't have that, it couldn't go well. And if you
Mm,
had, let's say if you articulated very differently, if one person only liked to talk and the other person only liked to write, or if your cadence of expression was very different, or your need for emotional echoing was very different, any of those things, I can see how that would be very challenging to overcome as a
mm,
stylistic or temperamental point.
mm. And just to be clear to everyone listening, you are absolutely split down the middle in terms of responsibility and weight of decision in the business.
Yes, that's the intention.
Hmm.
Obviously, we each have different areas of specialization.
Yeah.
and different skills and expertise. But when it comes to decision making, especially the decisions that would sit at the level of the CEO role, um, we are fully agreed and fully committed to those being shared decisions.
Mm.
And we're very conscious and will signal when, one of us might take something because it doesn't require, let's say, a deep long discussion between the two of us. If it's a let's say a smaller specific thing, we might say, hey, I got this one.
Yeah.
So that whoever's asking us for input knows at what point who they're talking to in this.
Yeah.
But we'll also just as often and probably more often say like, okay, great, we'll sync on this and get back to you. And we do that and we have rituals for doing that throughout the week.
Yeah, because you must have to avoid the trap of almost being single CEOs of two companies within a company if you both have your own area of expertise.
Right, and it's kind of the ideal. So the reason for us specifically to take on this role as co-CEOs is really to mirror the development of the organization, right? And we've, like I mentioned before, we really are doing this very, very new thing that actually no one else has successfully done yet, which is to be a mass consumer app, millions and millions of users around the world, shipping fast, being very focused on what people want, and operating to the level of quality and the standard of care expected of a medical device company. And so those are traditionally very different organizations, and we are creating a new kind of organization that services both of those ends. And so in terms of how we work, we are also, I think, pointing ourselves towards being more and more merged. But of course, I mean, the company, we're at about 100 people now. We're aiming to grow very significantly this year. We're still small enough that, of course, there will be things that we jump into, and we won't always jump
Mm.
together. We'll decide who needs to go and pick up this ball depending on whose area it's in.
Awesome.
I mean, to kind of elaborate a little on the advantages of this. So part of that journey of going from, let's say just a consumer app to a medical device is that we have to implement a quality management system, right? We have to hold ourselves accountable to standards of quality and processes and procedures that are not normal to that consumer tech agile setup. Um, but I think it could fall into the trap where if you were going through any kind of transition like that, you might say, well, this part of the organization, they're the ones that have to worry about, this new thing that you're trying to weave into the org. And having, part of the intention of having two of us and having us represent those two sides and almost our conscious decision to stay aligned and stay synced on a very, very regular basis is to make sure that that never happens, that it's not just one side of the organization that is responsible for something, but that we in either managing or representing the different sides of our orgs when we do split apart, that we're always aware of what another function or what another part of
Mm.
the org might be experiencing and going through and needing.
Mm.
Yeah,
I
and
suppose it
it's
does. Sorry, carry on, Carrie.
I'm just going to mirror you again here, Audrey. But I think the thing is really it's about creating a microcosm and a microculture in leadership that we want to create in the wider org, right? I think we're big believers in that in general. It's like you've got to walk the walk and practice what you preach. And it would have been very difficult to actually find one individual person who had both of those experiences and could actually marry that up in a way that credibly, set the scene for everybody else.
Mm. I think that's so true. And I know you mentioned it in the article when it was announced about this new partnership that you get a diversity of thought, a diversity of opinion, and I think you used the phrase, the old hero CEO model, and I think that kind of lends itself again to that, that stereotypical alpha male who's kind of taking on everything, has their vision and their clarity as well. Now, in my research before this episode, obviously one of the criticisms of co-CEO partnerships is there can be that sort of lack of vision, so to speak. And some people have hit back and said that you don't get clarity in decision making and um, that clear leadership. Now, what would you say to those sort of criticisms of this co-CEO model?
I mean, I agree it's a danger. It's clearly a danger. Um, but I think there are also dangers in lone leaders who are not accountable to anybody else
Mm,
immediately. I just want to acknowledge that first off the bat. Like, that's not an unreasonable worry to have. And we had it. You know,
mm,
uh, when we decided, and it was actually Ida's idea
mm,
that this would be a good model going forward. You know, we spent a solid weekend telephoning absolutely every co-CEO we could find, and trying to figure out what are the pitfalls, what are the problems that we need to address in advance that are maybe inherent in this model.
mm. Yeah, how many companies are now adopting this across the board? You said you both sort of spoke to co-CEOs. I mean, how much of a thing is it? I see it time and time, sort of not time and time again, occasionally, but are we still a few years off this being the norm?
I mean, I don't have the data. I wouldn't know how many in general, but it's not as unusual as perhaps we thought before we embarked
Okay,
on this. And certainly, the world I come from, the world of law firms, right? Partnership is the standard.
of
And
course, yeah.
so, for consultancies, for partnership, for law firms, for uh, professional services in general, I think this is a very well tested model. Um, Probably less so for tech startups. But Audrey, I saw you were about to say something. I I acknowledge that it's a fair question, but we do have some answers also.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I believe actually, and one of our investors, NGP, Bo Ilso, he's the managing partner there. He mentioned that in his portfolio, in the NGP portfolio, about 30% of the startups in the portfolio have some type of co-leadership setup. And so I think you actually do see it quite a bit, especially with co-founders that
Mm,
that share the role of CEO. So I don't think it's as unprecedented as we think, but perhaps it's in the process of making it explicit and making it, and adapting it to the needs of the company that that we haven't heard as much about.
mm. Yeah, that's so true. I mean, you really are embodying that championing of diversity right at the very top. But before you got started on this journey, did you have like a pre-agreed set of values or principles, or a pre-agreed direction? I mean, how does it work? Is there anything like in writing or like a contract?
Well, we're in Germany, so we have a lot of contracts. I
Yeah.
learning, but not specifically about our co-CEO
Okay.
relationship. That being said, one of the things that really worked for us when we first started this role is that we wrote a working with us document, like a how we kind of a user manual to working with two co-CEOs as opposed to one CEO. And in that, we laid out certain things like, how do we signal, where a decision is coming from or where we are in the process of a decision? Who should you talk to about a particular thing? Or even I would say, like, one of the core values that we put down in that document and that we let the whole company know is that if you tell one of us something, just count on the fact that the other one is going to know probably within the
Mm,
span of 24 hours. Um, if not much sooner than that. And I think that sets up a it sets us off on a footing of trust and transparency, that also mirrored, I think, what we both wanted and needed out of this partnership.
mm.
And I would say, I think one of the things maybe that was inherent in your question also, Alex, was um, how do you how, decision speed, right? Like how does this not ping pong
Yeah.
between you, or you're being
Mm.
asked by different people the same question, or the same person different, And I would say overall, there are not that many decisions that are important and urgent, and we have a matrix for this, right? And some things will fall within our areas of greater expertise, and then we just quickly take them. If something is important and urgent, we drop everything and sync. That doesn't actually happen very often. More likely, you have big, important strategic decisions where you need a lot of clarity, and that needs to be a robust, reasoned decision. It needs to be maybe a bold decision. And I feel like having two people at the top really enhances accountability for all of those things.
Mm.
So, if I imagine myself alone chewing on a really tough decision, like I actually feel like the learning edge is greater when I'm in dialogue with Audrey, because she brings her perspective and her, she's faster to challenge me in my blind spots. I'm maybe faster to challenge her, and we reach a point that feels good and robust and strong, probably faster than I would alone. And if I did alone, and maybe this has happened a couple of times, and she challenges me, it's always better afterwards. And I think that's the key point.
Mm.
And just to
Audrey, would
add
you
to
agree?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think just to add to that is, in addition to challenging, the actual content of the particular decision, I've, Carrie also can remind me, hey, we've been swirling on this enough. Now is decision time. And in this dialogue setup, we have kind of built-in mechanisms to hold each other accountable to move things forward, as well as to explore and spend time when we need to. So it's almost a conscious approach, because we have to factor in somebody
Mm.
else's approach, somebody else's process, into it. So I mean, I would argue that this is actually, maybe it's unique to the way Carrie and I have found to communicate and to discuss particular decisions. But this is one of the strengths of a co-CEO, is
Yeah.
that built-in awareness and built-in accountability towards driving towards the decision, towards driving towards a good decision.
Mm. And I suppose those conversations as well, it's like a constant feedback loop, a constant iterative process that you two are having. Um, Clearly, I mean, even they always say the best way to share ideas or teach people is to just talk it through, and to really flesh out things, and to take decisions. But with your partnership itself, I know you keep each other accountable. Do you have anyone? I think you mentioned like an executive coach or something. So do you have like a mechanism in place that is really keeping your partnership accountable, sort of testing your partnership and almost making sure the way you two are working together is optimal?
I mean, I would, off the top of my head, say on the one hand, of course, we have the board, right, the supervisory board,
Mm.
that ultimately holds us accountable, and we
Yeah.
also have a very close management team, who we talk to a lot and we get feedback from, and who we relied on particularly in the first months of our co-CEO-ship to really help us shape how we interact with them, and help us kind of reflect on how we're showing up as a duo, both to the management team and to the wider organization.
Audrey, what would your thoughts be on that?
I completely agree that, two of our greatest accountability, one of our greatest accountability partners is the management team. And similarly, I think our coach has helped us quite a bit. One of the things that I learned from that process was that um, that there are things that we make time for and things that we don't. And some of the best investments of time have been time spent in person, with a loose agenda, maybe, but honestly, time blocked out for the two of us
Mm,
to build that relationship, um, to get a good sense of, and the way our coach puts it, like how the other person moves, how the other person speaks, all of the other intangibles that make for a relationship, and help us with things like being able to um, jump in and speak together in a Zoom call or in a video call,
mm,
with three people or with four people, or with the both of us there. So yeah, I think I completely agree that there are so many accountability structures that come with having a co-CEO ship, because one, we can remind each other also, like, hey, we should check in, or we should get feedback, or we should or we should work on this particular thing together, and that forces us to find other accountability partners out there to help us grow and help us develop.
super.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's also much easier to receive and integrate feedback because you are getting it all the time from the other. But also, it's just that, close and trusted companion on this journey who, if you get some tough feedback, you can just have that really open conversation. It's like, hey, is that fair? Yeah, they have a point. They have a point, and this is what their point is. And you have that's a quality of conversation that as a lone CEO, I don't know who you would have that with.
Hmm. Do you think the stresses of being at the top of a company are lessened in partnership? How is it from, because we obviously get stressed about our jobs. Um, how have you found it helped in your sort of the personal side of things?
I mean, I
I
would say
believe
absolutely.
absolutely.
The reason this didn't work is because your picture just froze. I would have been able to see. But it's good that we started with the same response. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, that would have been worrying
Yeah,
if.
one of them big, oh, not at all.
But yeah, just carrying that weight on your shoulders as one person. And yeah, you're right. When you are your own CEO, you have no one else knows how you feel in the business. You're very alone in that regard. So um, from that sort of mental health point of view, um, I mean, I'm guessing that that's benefited so much.
I mean, I don't know what it would be like to do this alone, but I'm guessing as well that it's benefited me so much to have Carrie to share this with. And it's everything from being able to just have somebody to empathize with your situation, to very practical things, like I do feel like I can take a day off,
Mm.
and I know that Carrie is synced enough and aligned with enough with me that we've got each other's back and we can cover for each other, and that no one in the organization feels like they're missing a co-CEO um, while we're on vacation. So that's huge, because rest is pretty important.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
Carrie.
I think that's actually really huge. And I don't want to gender this, but I do think that if you're a person who aspires to show up in their community in ways other than work, and I do, and Audrey, you do too, and we do in different ways. I have a young family. Audrey, you have other projects, and now obviously, being CEO is a very full time job. That it is always going to be that. It's a very high commitment job, but I think by sharing the role, you can continue to be a somewhat rounded person in a way that I think would be extremely difficult if you did it alone. And I don't know, we've been doing this for a year, but my hypothesis is that staying plugged into what other people's lives are like somewhat, even while doing an executive role like this, is has got to be beneficial for perspective, for emotional stability, and frankly for staying grounded and connected to what people need who also use our product. Right, we are a product for people. We want to be close to that. We don't want to live a completely different kind of crazy tech leadership lifestyle that isn't connected to those needs anymore.
Hmm. Awesome. Um, I don't know, Audrey, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I'll leave it at that.
Did you both ever? Did you aspire to be, C-level people, CEOs early on in your career? I'm guessing maybe not co-CEOs, and usually doesn't enter people's equations. But correct me if I'm wrong. But would you say you've been harbored that ambition for a long time? Audrey, you can go.
No, and I think some of my oldest friends, when they found out that I took on this role, they were like, "Didn't you say that you never wanted to be a CEO?" And eh, I really don't think that necessarily titles, like title was for sure not what drove me here.
Yeah.
Um, and so in my vision of like what I wanted to do and what impact I wanted to have, I was very focused on what that actual role, what that impact would be. And I think the thing in this situation that got me to change my mind was that okay, I the impact that Clue has on the world, that impact that resonates with me deeply. And if it makes sense, I mean, there's also something incredibly exciting about getting to define a co-CEOship, getting to design it for a specific user, for in this case the company. There's something so exciting about that, as well as so aligned with the kind of impact that we want to have, which is really world changing at Clue, and changing what we expect, changing what normal is. That was really what got me to come around to it, and the fact that I would have a collaborator for it,
Hmm.
Carrie. So no, it was not my ambition to begin with, um, but
Awesome.
it's definitely been a really rewarding learning experience.
And
Superb. And
same
Carrie, what about
here.
you?
Yeah, I mean, same here. I kind of almost wish I could tell you that it was my childhood dream because I do think like the will to power piece, the women aren't good at it, right? If we have it, we hide it. I wish I could tell you that I strove to get here and I did. Um, but really for me, it's very similar as for Audrey here. And
Hmm.
I guess if you're the kind of person who throughout their working life has always tended to take more responsibility, tended to want to be part of, the strategic vision setting, who has tended to take on a more communicative leadership role, there's a trajectory there. But no, I didn't set out to have this title.
Hmm.
I also
Okay.
think it helped that that was our starting point for both of us,
Mm-hmm.
because we approached this role from the same place and with the same motivators, and I think that has really helped to build this relationship.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I did just want to touch on before we finish up is that CEOs, C-level boards are dominated by men throughout the world. It's getting slightly better. Do you think this new co-CEO model lends itself now to give more opportunities for women to occupy these high-level positions? You two would obviously be way more qualified to sort of give an analysis on that. And you've mentioned yourselves that you wouldn't take on the CEO role on your own. So, what would your thoughts be on that?
I mean, I can maybe give a slightly traditional answer. I don't like essentializing arguments fundamentally, but I do think that certainly my experience looking at my friends and colleagues and peers sort of rising through the ranks, um, it the peak of your career or certainly an acceleration phase does very often coincide with having a young family if that's what you're doing. And I would hope this would apply to men and women equally. It
Hmm.
doesn't seem to. Um, but there are many women who are not prepared to be as absent as traditional executive leadership requires you to be from that experience. So, in that sense, I would say in general, yes. Um, but again, I would hope that this isn't actually a gendered thing, that this is more a, hey, times have changed
Mm.
kind of observation. And the other piece is, I do think, again, for whatever reason, the sort of collaborative model is really attractive to women who are more used to maybe consensus building and maybe less used to brute force and sort of lone CEO hero power kind of decision
Mm.
making models.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. I think you always try not to gender stereotype, but it's pretty hard not to. And in terms of the general population, it just feel it does sort of open things up a little bit more. I don't know, Audrey, if you had any thoughts on that.
Hmm. I I do think that the numbers show that, let's say, many rooms, call them boardrooms or whatever, many rooms are male dominated. And one of the things that I've noticed about having a female co-CEO is that, in many points in my career, I was the only woman in the room. And at least now there are at least two. And that does change the dynamics. It gives me somebody to demonstrate that, the decision making and dialogue concept that we do together, while in a room that might be full of, you know that might be male dominated in the first
Yeah,
place. So I think that is something that's nice, in addition to what Carrie mentioned earlier.
amazing. One thing as well before we finish up, I'll come to each of you just to end it. If there are people listening, whether it's companies or people looking to progress in their career, and have the opportunity to maybe push forward this co-CEO idea within their business. Carrie, I'll come to you first. What sort of bits of advice would you give to a business looking to design their leadership in this newer way?
Hmm. Well, think about what complementary skills you really want to see represented at the top and see this as an opportunity to put together the unicorn that you could never recruit in one person. And, to the individuals potentially filling the role, I would say definitely do the analysis, like look at different dimensions of working together and see if it's compatible and see if it works. But also don't also do the sniff test. Like, are you comfortable in each other's company? Um, that's so important.
Amazing, thank you. And Audrey, what would you add?
I kind of compare this to, let's say, designing products. Look at look at your user. Look at the humans that have to interact with the system. Look at a good experience might what should a good experience look like, and design something from there. For us, it made a ton of sense for all of the reasons that we spoke about, because we were trying to evolve a company to marry together two sides of a business. And even if it didn't, even if it was a less traditional model for leadership, it was what was right for us. And so finding that piece of what being able to say, like, hey, it might not be normal, you don't see
Mm,
it very often, but if it really works for you, make it work for you. And I would only, on the other side, like, what advice do I have for individuals? It's the, just remember to constantly improve. If this is the model that you think was really going to work, just remember that it's Maybe it's because there's somebody else to bear witness to this process, but it is constantly evolving, and we are constantly getting new data points or new information that would mean that, oh, we've got to rewrite our user manual, or figure out a new setup, or divide up certain tasks that we thought we would fully share before. And that adaptability, that agility, I think is important to apply to this particular type of leadership setup, because somebody's there forcing it to evolve and forcing it to improve and change.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, we will wrap things up there. I know you two are incredibly busy. So, Carrie, Audrey, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And I know there's many people out there that will get a lot of value, but also inspiration from your stories as well.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you so much for listening to the Building Our World podcast. Every view, stream, and download is massively appreciated. If you're new here, then please go back through the catalogue. There's some great gems from some of the brightest and the best in Berlin tech. And if you really like what you hear, then please do hit that follow and subscribe button. That's it for now, but until next time, goodbye.